talked to Andreas Bartel, well-known Kanban coach and trainer. What are feedback loops?
I think essentially feedback loops can be described as a relationship between two parts, where the output of one part is as basically the input of the other part, and the output of a second part is feeding back as input into the first part. So feedback loops essentially are a bidirectional relationship between any parts you can think of. Maybe we can make an example. We are currently in Meyerhofen right now, and if you go hiking, for instance, you would probably pull out a map and maybe a compass. So the compass would guide you, give you some direction to go, and it would be working as a second part, is essentially give you guidance, information in what direction to hike or to walk at, so you finally reach your destination. So it's a closed loop relationship between you as a hiking person and the compass as a second part who is guiding you in that you walk in a particular direction you want to.
Positive versus negative feedback loops. What is the difference?
So once you couple two parts and you have a bidirectional relationship, you will find out that there's two polarities, one can say. One is a positive feedback loop, but the other one is a negative feedback loop. The positive feedback loop, you might say that this is something that reinforces what is already happening. So on the opposite, the negative feedback loop more or less works as a balancing feedback loop. So let me give you an example. For instance, for a negative feedback loop, the usual example is from the animal world. You have a predator-prey relationship. These are two parts which are coupled. Let's take a cheetah and gazelle example. The more gazelle you have as a prey for cheetahs, the more cheetahs you have, the more they eat the gazelle. But eventually they will reach a tipping point where this relationship will stabilize, because the more cheetahs you have, the more they eat the gazelle, and it will basically balance out the relationship between the gazelle and the cheetahs. This is like a negative feedback loop. On the other hand, you have a positive feedback loop. This is like you reinforce something you already have. A typical example is money on your bank account. The more money you have on your bank account, the more interest rate you get, the more money you generate on your bank account. So it's growing. You might also say might be an escalating feedback loop, because it will reinforce whatever happened before and eventually maybe end up in a blast or something like that. So this is the difference between the relationship of two coupled parts, negative versus positive. The one is reinforcing and the other one is more or less balancing out what happens between this or inside this relationship.
The importance of feedback loops.
Why are feedback loops important in business and in general? Maybe we start with more or less the general example. I think feedback loops is a natural phenomenon. So feedback loops are nothing, not anything that the humans invented in general. And feedback loops in nature are responsible for many things, like regulating populations, as we discussed in the example of cheetah and the gazelle, and they regulate climate change, unfortunately, unless the humans intervene. In the business world, of course, things change in the business environment. And for the business to survive, as for the cheetah and the gazelle, you need to adapt to this change. So first of all, you need some mechanisms to perceive the change, to capture the change, adjust internally, and then respond appropriately to the change. And usually this will cause also some effect on the market potentially, or your customers, or what your competitors do. Of course, it's a complex relationship, but in a sense of sense what happens in your business environment, adjust your internal mechanisms, respond to that, and sense again, right? And as in evolution or in the nature context, it's essential for the business environment that organization is capable of sensing any change that happens in the environment and adjust the actions of the organizations appropriately, that you can respond to the change in a sensible way, right? So in order, of course, to keep going as a business, to survive over a long-term period, even adapt to things like a pandemic. During the pandemic, not every organization has been able to survive. That might be broken feedback loops, maybe delays inside the feedback loops. So your capability as an organization to survive is essentially in some way or another dependent on your well-functioning feedback loops, that you can sense change in the environment and react appropriately.
What are broken feedback loops?
What is a broken feedback loop and how can you spot it? That can be a really complicated topic. I've been talking about it by using some metaphors or analogy from brain science. So what happens if some circuits inside the particular areas in your head are damaged through accident or disease, and how you would actually spot it. And my analogy was always, or at least so far from the brain science, you would observe it by a change of behavior. And in change of behavior in terms of a disease in the particular motor areas, which are responsible for motor control, moving arms, legs, fixing with your eyes, anything, grabbing like this cup of juice here. And in the case that you have a disease and you have suffered maybe an accident, you will observe that you will have a hard time coordinating actions, coordinating movements to reach your goal. And that might be grabbing this cup here, moving a piece of leather, or move in any way. So I am using this analogy in terms of look at your organization and how it actually reacts to change in the environment. How does it execute actions or behavior inside the organization? And if you can observe something dysfunctional in behavior, you should probably look behind that a particular feedback loop might be broken. So a typical example is one of the biggest companies on the planet who used to be really good at something, suddenly decline and maybe extinct. One of the famous cases is certainly the Kodak case, who used to be really good at producing films for making images. I would call it the need for digital photography. They even initiated projects to excel in digital photography. And I think Kodak has one of the first films that went on the moon and make pictures, but still they would not let go of their past competence and reinforced investments in existing competence just to observe a few years later how they decline. So this is what I call a broken feedback loop. The challenging part of that humans, which are responsible for making decisions inside the feedback loops, they are not robots, right? So the challenge is humans can always decide and override logic and make decisions that break the feedback loops. You perceive signals from your market, from your customer, from your stakeholders that usually would lead to change inside your organization, how you act back. But humans, for different reasons that are certainly interesting to discuss, would decide differently. And this is what I call a broken feedback loop, because the human factor is certainly one of the most influencing factors in feedback loops in organizations.
What does it mean to have well-established feedback loops?
I think the last question we talked about is what does it mean to have a dysfunctional or broken kind of thing of feedback loop. of course, requires an answer in what is meant by having a well-established feedback loop. I think the first thing you would need to do, recognize that you have a feedback loop at all, and then investigate or assess if that's producing the behavior or actions within organizations that they are appropriate to what you're sensing as input inside this feedback loop. And a well-functioning feedback loop, first of all, should be capable of changing the polarity. I think that was one of our second questions, like, is it positive, is it negative? So think about the Kodak example back again. If you've been investing in a particular area that you've been investing the last 50 years, this is in reinforcing feedback loop. So you are improving a skill at which you're already good at. But in some point in time, it might be necessary that you drop it. So that you reduce the investments in what you're already good at, because the market is behaving differently. You need to recognize that, and then you change your polarity in such a way that you maybe dampen something in order for free up capacity to build up different skills, because the market has changed. And I think a well-functioning feedback loop can be described as the organizational capability of turning on and off between these polarities of positive and negative feedback loops in such a way that in combination of this on and off provides you the results, the appropriate reactions and behaviors that make sense from a market or stakeholder customer perspective, that you don't get stuck in one or the other. In terms of change management, for instance, that would be a negative feedback loop, that if you have something bouncing back again, you introduce a change, for instance, and after a period of time you realize you're back again and where you have started. So that must be an indication that you potentially are stuck in a negative feedback loop that is the goal of remaining or keeping the status quo. So the challenge is to recognize that and find a way to switch the feedback loop polarity, that you can, if it's necessary, go to negative or to positive feedback loops. You have this build-up capability that you do it in time and appropriately, that you either not stuck in one position or one capability or skill, for instance, and also you don't reinforce things that you actually should have dropped maybe a year ago, right? And I think that's the key element of that.
Are feedback loops just meetings?
That's a very interesting question. So this is feedback loops related to meetings. Is there any sense of one-to-one mapping, right? If you can refer back to the first question we had discussing what are feedback loops and do they occur naturally, you will probably make the inference that you will have, especially inside organizations, all kinds of feedback loops working all over the place without a meeting. And that can be such a thing like a chit-chat at a coffee machine. Like a boss is meeting with someone else, or a boss's boss, they have a chit-chat at the coffee machine and make some decisions. This is a human nature, right? So you don't have to have meetings in order to have feedback loops. Actually, feedback loops are agnostic. I would even call it agnostic to anything a human can invent or introduce in an organization, because they exist anyway. So I give you an example. We are sitting here. I am talking, you are talking, you do reactions, I do react to that. That's a feedback loop. We don't have to call it anything, right? But this is something that naturally occurs between people, between groups of people, between departments, customers, stakeholders, service teams. So the simple answer to that question would be you don't have to have a meeting, right? But one of the following questions will lead to, okay, how can we use maybe meetings or different forms, and what are the benefits if we have any, right?
Feedback loops and cadences. What is the relation?
So the relationship between a feedback loop and a cadence, we might express it that if we have feedback loops and we just answered the question previously, we don't actually need a meeting. But in order to make it explicit and to have some control of what happens inside the feedback loops, we would need an appropriate cadence in terms of when we actually make those feedback loops explicit, such that in a way we can have control about what happens in this meeting, and have the benefit of maybe switching the polarity, reduce something that should not be happening, and maybe stabilize different things. So the cadence is in terms of how often do you want to make this feedback loop explicit in your particular context, business context, such that you have actually awareness of what happens inside this feedback loop, how things work. You can basically assess, see, experience things, make decisions, and see what actions are, as a consequence of these decisions of being taken, and then get that as an input for the following up meeting. So getting control of and managing feedback loops, you need cadences. So I think this is the way where you should couple the things of what I said before. You have feedback loops naturally in your organization, but the means to have control of what happens inside these feedback loops is by implementing a cadence that you use to investigate and have control of the things that actually happen inside feedback loops. Make them explicit. I think this is really relevant.
Cadences in Kanban, what does it mean?
A cadence is something you may call the tact. So a regular event in some sort of that gives you an opportunity to review or investigate things. It's a time span where you look at what happens inside your feedback loop. So once a year, once a quarter, once a month, maybe once a week, or daily, right? And this definitely depends on what kind of information you get in your feedback loop, and how often you need to react to this information to close the loop. And that would be your guiding principle, how often or what your cadence would be for this feedback loop to review, for instance, as an example, right?
What are the cadences to get started with Kanban?
I think there's, from a Kanban perspective, one simple answer. And we usually begin with talking about service orientation. From the customer's perspective, you have a service, some sort of delivery, and you might investigate how good you are at this delivery. That would be to begin with one of the elements of the standard cadence set would be flow review or service delivery review, depending on your maturity level. Basically, it is about how well are you delivering stuff. That will be one of the cadences that are essential. So how good are we at what we're doing? Let's talk about that, right? That will be a first feedback loop. On the other hand, or the other side of your service to begin with is the replenishment meeting, for instance, right? That will be a second part or second cadence. You look at what should we start with? What is it the customer wants to be done next, or our stakeholders, right? This is the part where you open up the gate to your delivery pipeline and said, okay, what is the next thing we should be working on? This is certainly essential. And of course, how can we manage what happens in between replenishment and delivery, right? That would be a Kanban meeting, right? This is to guide and as a feedback loop to regulate the delivery pipeline in how well are we basically managing the delivery process to the customer. And that can be on a daily basis, that can be twice a week, or once a week, once a month. It depends on your on the scale and your context, of course. So from a Kanban's perspective, there are 3 elements to the standard set. You have the replenishment meeting where you make the decisions of, okay, what is the most essential, most urgent part or element we should be working next. Then you need to some sort of organize, regulate, manage the delivery. This is like the operational perspective on that, right? And of course, once you're done with that, hey, let's look at what we have delivered. How well are we doing this, right? And reflect if we can improve on the delivery. So this, I would say, these are the essential elements of the cadence set, standard cadence set from the Kanban's perspective.